How big is that hole that the Chancellor has to plug in day-to-day spending, really?
Well, all the numbers you just quoted are genuinely big. I mean, it's sometimes hard to get your head round. Is $1 billion big? Is 40 billion big? Well, 40 billion is big. If that is the scale of tax rises, possibly, it was certainly one of the biggest tax rising budgets in history if we get something along those lines. And if that's where we end up, would be, you can measure these so-called black holes in all sorts of different ways. But I think if we're going to get spending rising, even just in line with national income over the next few years, and you take account of the shortfall this year, you can easily get to a number like 40 billion, which, as I say, is a genuinely big number in these kinds of in these circumstances.
Well, it's quite a task, though, because, in fact, before the election, you warned against ruling out too many taxes, and they've ruled out, 75% of the revenue stream. Do you think the Chancellor's boxed herself into a place where she's made the task more difficult than it needs to be?
Well, you're right. We certainly did say before the election, if you look at the figures that this government inherited, it was obvious that they were either going to have to cut spending, which is what the previous government said they were planning to do, or increase taxes. But of course, no party was willing to say that. That's why we called it a conspiracy of silence at the time. Now, to what extent has the Chancellor boxed herself in? Well, she's clearly taking the view that her commitment not to increase national insurance contributions didn't refer to the bits of national insurance contributions that employers pay. It's been pretty heavily briefed that we're going to get a pretty chunky increase in those. Now, if you need to raise 40 billion, you have to do something with income tax, national insurance or VAT. There is simply no sensible way of raising that sorts of money without raising one of those taxes. And the way that the Chancellor's getting round her pledge is to say it didn't apply to the employer chunk of national insurance.
Well, they're talking now about raising somewhere between 1 and 2p on national insurance, employers' national insurance contributions. That might get you to 20 billion. Where else might the rest come from? People are talking about capital gains tax. Inheritance tax seems to have faded out of the window. But are there any other places that you would look?
Well, there are something like 9 billion of tax rises in the manifesto. Now, half of that, possibly more than half of that, is the ever-present "we'll crack down on evasion and avoidance" stuff, which you can never
It's never happened, has it?
It's very hard to tell whether that ever happens. And then there are little bits and pieces from non-doms, from private equity, from private schools and so on, all of which are very small and somewhat uncertain numbers. Beyond that, I expect we'll get some sort of change to capital gains tax, won't raise a great deal of money. We might get some changes to the taxation of petrol. We certainly need to, stop cutting that, as we have been for the last 15 years. But the problem is that once you start fiddling around with these other taxes, it gets very complicated and quite risky. And I think it sounds like the Treasury have been, or the Chancellor's been told by the Treasury that some of the things she was planning, even on non-doms and so on, might not raise the money that she was hoping.
I think your colleagues have said that the proposed change on non-doms might actually raise nothing.
Well, we really don't know. I mean, the big changes were actually legislated by the previous government, and the additional changes I think this government wanted to make were on inheritance tax rules. And certainly if you talk to all the sort of legal advisors and so on around this, that sounds like it's the sort of thing which might be the straw that actually pushes more of them out of the country.
On all of this, the one thing she can't do is spend a lot more money in departmental spending. Now, what they've pledged to do, for example, is to protect the NHS budget. If they do what we're hearing they're doing, what do you think that's going to mean for non-protected departments, Home Office and so on?
Well, if we get tax rises of the scale that it looks like we might, then that will at least allow some increases for other departments, but they still won't look like very generous ones. Now, part of the problem, of course, is the NHS is so big that if, for example, they were to be as generous as 4 or 5% a year increases, and remember, that's nowhere near as big as the last Labour government was able to give the NHS, that still leaves other departments quite tight. Increases in their budgets, but probably not even increases in line with national income. And of course, justice, local government, social care, the police, prisons, they're all really struggling at the moment. So we're in this really tough position where we could have the biggest tax-raising budget, or one of the biggest tax-raising budgets ever, and yet a lot of public services still feeling squeezed.
The other thing, well, you're the Institute for Fiscal Studies. We had the former governor of the Bank of England in a little earlier, Mervyn King, who said that the changes in the fiscal rules, which the Chancellor has already confirmed, are essentially an illusion. Do you agree with that?
I'm not quite sure what would mean by an illusion, but there's
well, what he basically says is you can change the fiscal rules all you like, but you're still borrowing.
Of course. I mean, and governments do change fiscal rules with alarming regularity. So let's not pretend this is something unusual. I mean, the last government changed them, goodness knows how many times, whilst it was the same government in office. But what it looks like Rachel Reeves will do is not so much change the letter of the rules as to change the definition of debt. But of course, that doesn't actually change anything real. It just means that she's targeting a different measure of essentially the same thing. Now, that measure, as it happens, and this is obviously why she's doing it, will give her more space to borrow against those rules. But the constraint always is, what will that do to the cost of government debt? So she's going to be very careful, I think, to be clear that it's not going to be used to a huge extent.
By the way, the story, you're off from the IFS next year. The story that we're hearing from Liz Truss and others is that part of the problem with Britain is that the IFS and you personally are just too powerful. People pay too much attention to you. Are you guilty?
If only. In terms of all of the things that we say, for example, needs to be done to the tax system, reform stamp duty, reform the council tax system, not impose national insurance on employers, but maybe do something with income tax. It doesn't feel terribly powerful at all. But I think what Liz Truss and others are saying is, we say uncomfortable truths, as we did before the election. It was obvious before the election taxes would have to rise or spending be cut. We're seeing it now, but the politicians don't like to say it.
Paul Johnson, thank you so much. I hope we'll see you again before you leave.
Thank you.